Hello, everybody. So today I want to take us through some of the most important nutrient cycles, specifically the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Before we do that, I thought I would take a backward step and talk for a second about why these atoms are so important to life. Nitrogen is one of the most important components of proteins. A large amount of nitrogen is needed in proteins, and proteins are the major structural and catalytic molecules of life. In other words, they form skeletal structures within cells, the so-called cytoskeleton, and they form enzymes which carry out metabolism, which is the chemistry of life. In addition, nitrogen is very important in DNA. So nitrogen is exceptionally important for those molecules. Phosphorus is a major component of the DNA backbone. So it's part of the structure of DNA, and therefore we need a large input of phosphorus. Sulfur is a necessary component of several amino acids, and those are the building blocks of protein, so obviously they're important, but only some of the amino acids contain sulfur. And finally, most molecules in living cells have a carbon backbone, and so we need a lot of carbon skeletons, as they're called, to build all the other molecules. So that's a brief overview of why these nutrient atoms are so important. Let us talk for a second about decomposers. And imagine a world without detritivores and decomposers. Well, what would happen is all the useful atoms would eventually be stuck inside waste materials, and everything would come to a grinding halt. And so decomposers recycle atoms to a form that is available to primary producers. And we saw that when we looked at the food chains and food pyramids. So the decomposers produce ammonium, they produce sulfate, they produce phosphate. And ammonium contains nitrogen, sulfate contains sulfur, and phosphate contains phosphorus. And so we can imagine a giant cycle for each of these three atoms, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And these matter cycles, you might think at first that they're entirely physical and chemical, but they're often driven by organisms. So they're the interaction of biology with physics and chemistry. The most important cycles that we're going to learn about are the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the sulfur. But there are other cycles as well. We're just not going to get into them. Before we get into the carbon cycle, let's talk generally about cycle diagrams. Cycle diagrams look complex because a lot is going on in them. They consist of a series of pools in which the atom of concern is located and a series of processes by which the atom of concern is changed from one form to another. Pools are represented as boxes and processes as arrows. And here is one such cycle, the nitrogen cycle. And you might look at this and go, how am I ever going to understand that? Relax, have a sip of coffee, get motivated, and we will make sure that you understand this. Here's your pro study tip, though. The first thing is try to get the basic big picture items down, and then pick up on the details later as you go. Some general rules about the cycles that you will probably want to come back and read this slide after you have mastered the cycles once again, just so that you can see that they make sense to you, is that in many of the cycles, the atom occurs in both usable forms and non-usable forms. And when I say usable, I mean usable by life. The atom moves through ecosystems in both biotic and abiotic states, meaning inside life and outside life. In general, the cycles keep the material in the ecosystem in a usable form. The system does not depend in the short term on constant input, although on the long term it probably does depend on constant input. And the long-term process of sequestration of the atom into a usable form and release into non-usable forms are generally less important than the short term within ecosystem cycling processes, the exception of that being the carbon cycle, as we will see. And cycling involves geological and chemical processes, but is often driven by biological processes, as I said earlier. Let's look at the carbon cycle. You already know a lot about the carbon cycle. We've talked about it. You know about photosynthesis, you know about cellular respiration, and you know about combustion, especially of fossil fuels. And you know that photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, cellular respiration puts it back into the atmosphere, as does combustion. Here is a picture of the carbon cycle, and you can see the cycle is here, right? And you can see photosynthesis occurring, and then the passing of carbon to various types of organisms, and then cellular respiration, putting the carbon dioxide back into the air. Decomposition is also a form of cellular respiration just done by decomposers. But you will notice we have one other way that atmospheric carbon is created, and that's by combustion, both human and natural, although human combustion is now a major force here. One other aspect of this that we will talk about more is the dissolution of carbon dioxide into water, and then the formation of minerals that get buried into sediments. The carbon cycle is really driven by photosynthesis and respiration. Carbon cycles into organisms via photosynthesis. The autotrophs have carbon that way, and then the heterotrophs eat the autotrophs or other heterotrophs, and they get their carbon that way. And then it goes back into inorganic carbon, which is carbon dioxide, via respiration in producers, consumers, and decomposers. Respiration, combustion, and decomposition are all similar in that they convert fixed carbon into carbon dioxide. The second part of this, which we haven't discussed that much in this course, but we've mentioned, is that atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean. And here's the chemical equation. So carbon dioxide and water react to form bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, which is also an acid ion. And that can further react to form just carbonate ion, and that should be a -2. Two minuses should be there, and two hydrogen ions, which are two acidic entities. So the dissolving of carbon dioxide into water creates carbonic acid. Thus, it causes ocean acidification. The ocean becomes more acidic as a result. And I want to take a little bit of time to look at that. Before we do that, I just want to show you a different carbon cycle diagram. And what I like about this one is it gives equal emphasis to the ocean. Once again, you can see photosynthesis and plant biomass and then plant respiration. Notice this one completely omits the animals. They just are considered minor compared to plant respiration and decomposition. This one also shows anthropogenic carbon. You should know that word, anthropogenic, meaning caused by human beings. And finally, it shows the dissolution of carbon dioxide into the ocean. It shows that there's photosynthesis in the ocean and decomposition, that some carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere from the ocean, and that some of the carbon becomes sediment in the ocean, and these can become minerals and fossil fuels. So this is just a different way of looking at the carbon cycle. Now, let's get back to ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is sometimes called global warming's evil twin. Well, let's see why that is. Global warming is caused by increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere means that there's going to be more dissolution into the ocean. The natural pH of seawater is about 8.2. That is slightly basic, and it is currently about 8.1. In other words, it's decreased due to anthropogenic carbon. As more carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, the pH is expected to continue to decrease. The ocean will become more acidic. Now, here's the issue with that. Many sea animals, for example, corals, plankton, crustaceans, and mollusks, build their skeletons, and by that I mean their shells, out of carbonate minerals that are composed of calcium carbonate. So what, you say? Well, as pH decreases, calcium carbonate becomes increasingly soluble in water. In other words, it dissolves. And so this means that sea animals have to spend more of their energy building shells and have less energy to devote to other aspects of their energy budget. And you can imagine that eventually that means that they won't be able to grow or reproduce, and that will mean that ultimately will die before making another generation or adding to the biomass. So that's ocean acidification's major issue. Now, how have humans affected the carbon cycle? Well, you probably can think of lots of ways. First, the burning of fossil fuels has increased atmospheric carbon. We know that one. Similarly, destruction of plant communities, especially forests, have decreased the carbon sink found in living plants on Earth, found in all the biomass on Earth. Plowing of soils and the consequent oxidation of soil organic matter has decreased the carbon sink in the soil. Pollution that reduces phytoplankton productivity has reduced the carbon sink in the ocean and possibly also the deposition rate of carbon minerals on the floor of the ocean. Each reduction in a carbon sink necessarily means that the carbon had to go somewhere. And where did it end up going? Into the atmosphere. Here's a graph we've already seen. It just shows the buildup of atmospheric carbon dioxide since 1960. As you can see, it looks like it's an exponential curve. So that's the carbon cycle. Let us move on to the nitrogen cycle. And I'm warning you in advance, the nitrogen cycle is much more complex. Here's the nitrogen cycle. Don't freak out. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere, and here it is up here. 78% of the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen, and yet all gaseous nitrogen is useless to animals and plants. In order for it to become usable, it must be fixed. That means combined with other atoms. It must be fixed by a few types of bacteria and cyanobacteria. In other words, all of the ecosystems in the world are dependent on these bacteria. There would be no animal and plant multicellular organism-based ecosystems without these single-celled prokaryotic organisms that actually can take atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into biologically useful compounds. I want you to think about that. To me, that's always a very heavy concept. Once nitrogen is fixed, it cycles around the ecosystem from one organism to another. One bacteria turns fixed nitrogen, however, back into gaseous nitrogen. Can you see where it is in the cycle? Right here where I'm pointing, right? In other words, these denitrifying bacteria take nitrate and convert it back into this inert nitrogen gas. If you look at this cycle for a second, you can probably see that it consists of two cycles. One is this external cycle of fixation and denitrification, fixation and denitrification. And the other is this internal, what I like to call ecological cycling, where nitrogen stays within living organisms. It gets decomposed into ammonium and then gets picked up by plants, which get picked up by animals, which then get decomposed. All the waste from both of those get decomposed by detritivores and decomposers, and it just cycles within the ecosystem. These processes of fixation and denitrifying bacteria tend to be slightly less important for ecosystems in the short term. In the long term, they are important. Now, it's interesting that ammonium is slightly toxic to organisms, and so the preferred form for picking up nitrogen from the soil for most plants is as nitrate. This conversion of ammonium to nitrate is also done by bacteria. It's called nitrification, and it's done by nitrifying bacteria, surprisingly enough, and so it's part of this cycle. And I want you to notice that the decomposers release ammonium as a waste product and a decomposition product. And so this nitrification facilitates the growth of plants by having the natural process of ammonium being converted to nitrate happen a lot more quickly by these bacteria. Be aware how many of these processes are caused by bacteria. Here they are: nitrogen fixation, nitrifying bacteria, denitrifying bacteria, and decomposition. A couple of other asides that I want to talk to you about. There are some plants that have a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, particularly legumes, but other species as well. And what they do is they trade sugar to the bacteria, which the plant makes a lot of, for nitrogen, which the bacteria makes a lot of. A second thing I wanted to point out is that nitrification, the conversion of ammonium to nitrate, is not the opposite process of denitrification, which is the conversion of nitrate back to nitrogen gas. This is annoying, and it makes me want to pull the hair out of the person who invented these terms, but that's the way it is. Nitrification is ammonium to nitrate, and denitrification is nitrate to nitrogen gas. They are not opposite processes. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. Now, how have humans affected the nitrogen cycle? Well, the major way is humans have invented this way of taking nitrogen out of the air using huge amounts of fossil fuel energy, combining with hydrogen gas and producing ammonia. And this is called the Haber-Bosch process. It is largely used to make fertilizer for agriculture. And so humans have introduced a huge amount of nitrogen into the environment by making synthetic fertilizer. When the nitrogen fertilizer is added to an agroecosystem, it doesn't just stay there, it moves about. Some of it is denitrified and sent back up with the nitrogen gas. Some of it runs off into surface water. Some of it percolates through the soil down into groundwater. And some of it goes into our food crops and therefore into us, and then it is flushed down our sewage systems as waste. At any rate, the idea is that there's a huge amount of nitrogen going into the environment compared to just 100 years ago. And we know that nitrogen added to ecosystems has a lot of repercussions. For example, in ecosystems, species diversity decreases. When nitrogen fertilizer gets washed into surface water, it can cause algal blooms and a process called eutrophication that we're going to learn about later. And eutrophication causes all sorts of problems. It can contaminate groundwater, and that can have negative health effects, especially on infants. And bacterial denitrification of fertilizer increases nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, and nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. Additionally, we put more nitric oxide and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels, and these also cause acid rain. So these are the major ways that humans affect the nitrogen cycle. Here's a graph of the increase in nitrogen fertilizer use, and you can see that humans have just added a ton, and the natural fixation of nitrogen in agroecosystems is increasing, but you can see how much more fertilizer has added. So that's it for today. I hope now you understand two of the most important cycles, and that they aren't too difficult to understand, and all the details will come in time as you become more and more familiar with it. Until next time, study hard.